Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Connolly, and I am the Head of Member Services for AgencyIQ here at Politico. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those who are not familiar with us, welcome to AgencyIQ. AgencyIQ is Politico's regulatory division. Our mission is threefold. First, to increase the capacity of our clients by monitoring the FDA on a daily basis and tracking each guidance, new rule, update coming out of the FDA, and analyzing the historical background, context, latest news, and of course, the future impact that each development will have on the industry. Second, we seek to decrease the challenges that come with translating what is happening at the FDA for your key stakeholders or your clients. And third, providing a third-party perspective on major trends that we're seeing at the FDA and across the life sciences industry, which is what you will see from us today. We're thrilled to have several of our current clients on the line with us. If you are not currently a client but are interested in learning more about AgencyIQ and exploring subscription options, you will find my email at the bottom of each slide and at the end of the presentation. We're also very interested in hearing your feedback on what we presented today and what topics you would like to see us cover in future webinars. And so myself or someone from my team will be in touch to gather any guidance or suggestions for our next discussion. Thank you again for joining. We're so glad to have each of you with us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alec to take it from here.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Colleen. This is Alec Gaffney. I'm the head of research at AgencyIQ. For those of you who have joined us before, you know you're in for a wonderful hour of regulatory commentary and insights and analysis. One small change, normally we do have our videos on. However, having received my second dose of the COVID vaccine yesterday, I am looking a little worse for wear today. So in the interest of having the focus be on the content and not on how uncomfortable I physically look, we're going to keep it like this. But our focus today is on a question that we have heard over and over and over again in the last few weeks, and that is, what has the FDA done during the Biden administration? How is it changing compared to what it looked like under the Trump administration? Are there things we've learned about the agency? Are there things that are of interest or of concern to the life sciences community and regulatory community? And are there things that just need to raise to the level of urgent action, or are there things that need to be just kind of kept on the back burner? We're going to talk about 11 things that we think you ought to be paying attention to today. And I'm not going to read off this list, but at a very high level, you know, we're going to talk about leadership at the FDA and how that's evolved, regulatory actions and how those have also continued to evolve, and some rather interesting ways, some areas of new concern and attention by the FDA that didn't exist under the last administration, and of course, the continuing effects of COVID-19. As many of you who have attended our prior webinars know, we can spend literally hours talking about the FDA and its response to COVID-19. Because we've talked about it extensively before, we're not going to focus on that too much today, but there are going to be some inescapable things that I think we need to pay attention to, and we'll go into those. I am, of course, glad to have some of our researchers with us today. We have Laura D'Angelo, who's going to be covering some of our medical device topics, Kirsten Mesmer, who's going to be talking a little bit about some of the biotech and pharma things that we've seen, and Lily Rosenfield, who will be talking about some of the approval trends in recent months. So with that being said, let's get started and start with a little bit of palace intrigue. I think if we had one prediction at the start of the Biden administration, it was that Joe Biden would hurry to appoint a permanent FDA commissioner. And the need for credible expert leadership in the midst of a pandemic is incredibly important. But so far, Biden just hasn't seemed like he's in a hurry to make a selection. And since the early days of the administration, the FDA has been led on an acting basis by someone who should be familiar to just about everyone on this call. That is longtime former CDER Director Janet Woodcock, who has been on leave, or rather was on leave during much of the past year, leading the therapeutics efforts of Operation Warp Speed. Woodcock is in many ways a very obvious choice for the job of both acting commissioner and permanent commissioner. She practically is CEDAR, having led it for literally decades through some exceptionally contentious decisions. You know, the good times and the bad times. Janet Woodcock has been there through almost the entirety of CEDAR's modern existence. But that experience is in some ways as much a liability as an asset in this political climate. And Woodcock's chances of receiving a formal nomination, I think in many ways have been imperiled by serious political opposition against her candidacy owing to several decisions or lack of decisions in some cases on certain topics. And by far the most noteworthy of these concerns can best be summarized in a single question. Did the FDA do enough to slow or prevent the opioids crisis? Now, according to some legislators, the answer to that is no. And Woodcock, as head of CEDAR, bears some personal responsibility for the opioids crisis, they argue, due to the agency's failure to take prompt, decisive action. And while Woodcock is the incumbent, and I think there's no other way to describe her other than the incumbent, it may also be the case that she just doesn't have the political support. And by that, I mean the votes to get confirmed. Several Democratic legislators, including Joe Manchin, have said that they would not vote for her, in large part due to the opioids issue. And there are indications that Woodcock may be taking steps to cement a few final parts of her legacy under the assumption that she might not be able to get confirmed. Last week, for example, Woodcock formally announced that Patrizia Cavazzoni, her former #2 at CEDAR, would take over as the permanent leader of CEDAR, and that Woodcock would not return to that position regardless. There are a few ways, I think, to read that decision, but I like to think of it as Woodcock kind of burning the boats, if you're familiar with that term, as it were, that coming from a story where Spanish conquistadors land in South America, and to kind of force people not to go back to whence they came, the leader of that expedition burning the boat so that the only way was forward. I kind of see that in regulatory terms here. She's all in for the commissioner's job, and if she does not get that position, at least her legacy at CEDAR is in good hands with Cavazzoni, who she originally kind of brought into the organization, or rather the agency. So let's shift gears a little bit. If Woodcock isn't necessarily in favor, who else might be in the running? Well, based on reporting in the Wall Street Journal last week, as well as some additional reporting by other outlets, including Politico, it seems like the Biden administration is seriously considering some names that hadn't previously been in contention, including several former FDA officials. I think the name on this list, which is probably most familiar to people, is Michelle McMurray-Heath, who is the current head of the industry group Bio and was formerly the associate science director of the FDA CDRH and the global leader for regulatory sciences at Johnson & Johnson. Another candidate, Florence Houn, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, was up until recently the vice president of global regulatory science at Celgene and served as at the FDA as deputy director of their Office of Vaccines, the director of drug evaluation at CEDAR, and the division director at CDRH. That alone is pretty impressive. It's not often you find FDA officials who have served in high-level capacities in multiple centers, so that may be a strong asset there. Also, Gayatri Rao was the director of the Office of Orphan Products Development and associate chief counsel at the FDA. She's now at Rocket Pharma. The only new name under consideration without extensive FDA experience is Catherine Lizuriaga, who has extremely extensive clinical development experience and is well known for her work on HIV research and knows the FDA very well from an outside perspective. And I don't think it's necessarily a precondition to have FDA experience to become FDA commissioner. And I think a recent example of that is actually the prior FDA commissioner, Robert Califf, whose experience is in many ways very similar to Catherine Lizuriaga's here. It's also worth noting here, I think, that the Biden administration has recently come under fire for, let's say, a lack of high-level appointments of Asian American and Pacific Islander descent. It's also worth noting that the FDA has only ever been led by two women, those being Jane Henney and Margaret Hamburg, and not a single person who is Black or Asian. So Lizuriaga, Houn, and Rao, and McMurray Heath would, if selected or appointed and confirmed, all be historic firsts for the FDA in that regard. And, as we've mentioned, are extremely well qualified. So let's move on to our next slide here, talking about what the FDA has kind of been doing. And let's start just by stating the obvious. The start to any new administration tends to be a little bit slow. And that's because the new administration typically will enact what's called a regulatory freeze to allow it to review what the previous administration has done, get its own regulatory and legal staff into place, and then start reviewing documents to kind of know what it doesn't know. The first 3 months of the Biden administration haven't been any different in this regard. In fact, the only regulatory documents released have been relatively minor fixes, or those intended to undo Trump administration actions that were deemed especially controversial. So, for example, you may have seen last week, the FDA announced that it was going to be rescinding actions that would have removed, many medical devices from the 510K category and allowed them to be marketed without FDA review. On the other hand, very few guidance documents have been released, and most of those were related to the COVID-19 public health emergency, as you can see on the slide here during Q1. And this includes, by the way, some actions made under Trump. There were only 19 guidance documents released, which is a little bit more than historical starts to prior presidential terms, but still very, very low compared to what the FDA does during a normal quarter. So I think regulatory professionals also need to be wary. And based on AgencyIQ's review of historical data, a slow start to administration may be followed by a very heavy volume of guidance being released. So for example, the Trump administration had a slow start to Q1 and Q2 with just 17 guidance documents and then 4 guidance documents released respectively in Q1 and Q2. But in Q3, it released 33 guidance documents, followed by 72 in the fourth quarter. And that was the highest number since the Bush administration. So the FDA's policy staff have certainly published guidance agendas talking about what they want to do. And there are lots of things they want to accomplish this year, inclusive and in addition to COVID. But it's likely that those documents are still being worked on right now, even if they're not being released. And we may see a wave of guidance documents start to be released in the coming weeks or months once that freeze fully thaws. Now, on the regulatory side, we haven't seen any new regulations proposed, or at least nothing that we haven't seen under previous regulatory agendas. If you look at the Office of Management and Budget, a few weeks ago, they released their unified agenda talking about, well, here are the things that we want to do. If you read that list and look back to previous editions of the unified agenda, every single thing on there had previously been on there. And that's not necessarily unusual, again, because the Biden team would want to review that sort of thing before it made its way into the unified agenda. So look forward to some additional things being put on there in the coming months, and certainly by the fall unified agenda. And that lack of FDA regulation is likely a reflection, as I noted, of a leadership void at the FDA and HHS. As we talked about in the last slide, the FDA still does not have a permanent leader, and is instead being led by Acting Commissioner Jenna Woodcock. And HHS Secretary Javier Becerra was not confirmed by the Senate until April 18th of this year. And in the absence of permanent leadership, it's unlikely that the FDA's policy staff have been working on new or significant regulations, or at least in the sense that they're feeling confident to tell the world about them just yet. It's likely that the life sciences industry will see significant changes to the FDA's regulatory agenda and unified agenda by the end of this year. So the next thing is, well, what's the upshot to all this? Well, the first 3 months of the Biden administration have seen an FDA that is basically the same as it was under the last administration in many key aspects. Sure, there are some new political appointees, but the heads of CDRH and CBER are the same. Cavazzoni is still leading CDER, which he was under the late Trump administration, albeit now on a permanent basis. Woodcock is still leading things, and there haven't been many significant policy changes that weren't already in the works during the last administration, of course, with the exception being the undoing of some of the more controversial ones. And the way I'm thinking about this is that in some ways, that's really good news for the life sciences industry and companies in particular. It means regulatory predictability, which means a greater ability to focus on operationalizing internal changes rather than trying to anticipate external changes led by the FDA. So number three is something that I've talked a little bit about in both of the last slides, but I really want to dig into a bit further here, and that is the FDA is starting to reassert itself. And while the FDA hasn't released too many policies, one area that it hasn't been shy about has been the release of these policies to undo some of what was done. For anyone who's been a little bit out of the loop, the FDA had a number of high-profile fights with HHS during the last administration. So for example, HHS, not FDA, decided to reclassify dozens of medical devices that have been subject to FDA oversight to class 1, which would be exempt from that oversight. That would have also allowed those products to be marketed without prior FDA review. HHS also stripped the FDA of its authority to regulate laboratory developed tests, and it decided to give the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health the authority to review certain laboratory developed tests on a voluntary basis. HHS also rescinded FDA's ability to collect OTC user fees on a temporary basis, and it also canceled the FDA's Unapproved Drugs Initiative. What we've seen, or what we're seeing in recent weeks, is the FDA and HHS, by the way, starting to walk back these efforts. So I talked about this a little bit before, but last week the FDA and HHS jointly announced that previous efforts to exempt dozens of medical devices from regulation would be canceled. The FDA also re-released its OTC drug user fee program after exempting distilleries from needing to pay the fee. The background there is that distilleries had been making hand sanitizer in addition to alcohol as a way to kind of boost supplies of hand sanitizer. And the medical device notice in particular was extremely interesting to us. If you go in and read that in depth, I kind of see that as an early indication that the new HHS Secretary, Javier Becerra, who signed that notice, by the way, is much more friendly to the FDA and is willing to defer to it on matters related to regulation and oversight. That could have broader implications for the FDA's efforts to reestablish its regulatory authority. And in some ways, the notice is also striking, a striking statement rather, about the FDA and HHS belief in its own authority. So for example, one notice states that the FDA believes it has both the authority and responsibility to execute provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, arguing that it should, quote, have at least some level of involvement in this type of action, given the expertise needed in evaluating whether a 510K submission is necessary to assure the safety and effectiveness of a device. Now, if you think back to the original release of that document, HHS had basically said, HHS is the parent organization of FDA. We don't have to get FDA's buy-in. We have the authority to do this. And FDA came back and said there are tons of mistakes that HHS made in that determination, from statutory mistakes to factual mistakes to just the basis on which HHS decided to do that in the first place. I'd really encourage anyone, in particular in the device space, to go back and read that. It is a fascinating notice by the FDA and HHS. So there are a lot of other things that the FDA hasn't yet had a chance to address, including the FDA's Unapproved Drugs Initiative. And we've actually heard rumors that an announcement on this is coming in a few weeks. That was reported in Kaiser Health News recently. In addition, the regulation of laboratory developed tests has also not been addressed by the FDA yet. But we do see the OTC and 510K announcements as indications that there is a correction coming for additional things, that the FDA is interested in kind of reasserting itself. We should also note too that there have been some political shifts as well. So during the Trump administration, the FDA was in court arguing that in-person prescribing of the abortion drug mifepristone was necessary under its risk evaluation mitigation strategy program. Last week, though, the agency announced that those in-person requirements were no longer necessary during the pandemic, clearing the way for prescribing of those medications through telemedicine. The bottom line to all this is this: the HHS versus FDA battles that were so rampant during the Trump administration do seem to be unwinding and showing signs of the two agencies just being more cooperative. I think, though, it's going to take time for all of these actions to be unwound, and it's not clear if HHS has the political capital or will to take action on every single thing. And I think LDTs, those laboratory developed tests, are going to be a key case study here, given the let's say, pushback that the FDA has gotten during the pandemic on its approach to testing. Now, I mentioned political capital during my kind of monologue there. I want to dig into this a little bit more. And I know most of the people on this call have a scientific background. Well, before I got into regulatory and got a master's degree in regulatory science, I got a bachelor's degree in political science. And since I so rarely get to use it, I'm going to use it today. And I want to talk briefly about one of my favorite political science concepts, and that is political capital. Simply put, political capital is a reflection of the amount of public and institutional support you have, or a president has, a leader has, anyone has, to take a particular action. So for example, let's say a new president is elected with an overwhelming majority and a friendly Congress. They've got a lot of political capital to do things. They can pass bills they want. They can, like Joe Biden promised, he got a whole bunch of stuff passed related to economic recovery. Conversely, though, a president who is, let's say, nearing the end of their term and without a majority of public support, they don't have a lot of political capital to do things. Think of Donald Trump toward the end of his presidency. There's a reason why it's called kind of a lame duck presidency, because they just can't do a whole lot of things. Now, when political capital is talked about in the popular press, it's almost always in the context of a president or a leader in Congress. But the concept applies in equal measure to regulatory agencies like the FDA. A regulatory agency with political capital can do difficult things like asking the public to trust it or make unpopular decisions that may be for the right reasons. Like elected, or rather unlike elected leaders, institutions tend to build up political capital over a long period of time across multiple administrations through good decisions and building goodwill with legislators and taking actions that are seen as protecting the public health and avoiding those that are seen as potentially damaging it. And if you've been paying attention over the last year, you know that the FDA's political capital is running low, or at the very least, it's running lower than it has been historically. And it's running low in a few populations in particular. I say the general public probably has more support for the FDA based on some recent surveys I've seen, but certainly in Congress, it seems to be running a little bit low. And it's running low for a few reasons, but basically for the same reason every other public health agency in the country is having a little bit of a tough time. It's had to make quick decisions on difficult matters under life or death circumstances, and often without support from leadership. In the Trump administration, certainly, and to a little bit of an extent under the Biden administration, which has taken a little bit more of a hands-off approach. And like every other entity in the pandemic, FDA has made mistakes, even if those mistakes have been for understandable or defensible reasons. But from what I've seen, there's started to be a shift in public discourse that I think represents a little bit of a troubling development for the FDA long-term, and that is that the FDA is seen as moving too slow, as it was during the review of vaccines. It's seen as sometimes being a barrier to public health, such as the regulation of LDTs or other diagnostics during both the early days and the late days of the pandemic. It's seen as being too risk averse, such as the case of its review of the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine. It's occasionally seen as bumbling, such as the case of charging distilleries user fees. It's sometimes seen as political, such as enabling President Trump on hydroxychloroquine or flip-flopping on mifepristone. All of this, I think, is having an effect, and I don't think I've ever seen as many Congress people publicly griping about the FDA as I have in recent months. And increasingly, it's become difficult for the FDA to ask people to place their trust in it, since skeptics can now point to a series of recent actions they perceive to be mistakes to argue that the FDA just isn't worth their trust. You see that, for example, in people who harbor anti-vaccine sentiments. You sometimes see that in legislators who are saying, why should we be delaying the Janssen vaccine if it's just going to be a minor labeling update, assuming that is what actually happens. So that also means that every action the FDA takes is now under the microscope, and that could have long-term implications for the agency's ability to operate under its current leadership structure. And here's something we'll talk in depth about a bit later, but all of this comes just a year before the FDA is slated to renew its user fee agreements for prescription drugs, medical devices, generic drugs, and biosimilars. politicians with a bone to pick with the FDA are, for the agency, dangerous to deal with. And the PDUFA and MDUFA reauthorizations are going to come at the height of the campaign and re-election season. So industry is going to have to keep an eye on this dynamic, because if it continues to get worse, those user fee reauthorization agreements are going to contain a lot of regulatory reforms, and some of them are not going to be great for either the FDA or industry. And the FDA may not have the political capital again to go ask legislators to defer to its expertise on certain regulatory matters, which now happens quite often. So I'm going to shift gears and actually stop talking for just a little while. I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Lily Rosenfield to talk about some interesting trends that we've been seeing in the approval space. Lily, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm excited to talk about this. So the fifth thing we've learned, I find somewhat surprising. So some FDA centers are having their best ever start to a calendar year, while others are showing record lows. Let's start by chatting about new drugs approved by the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, which is shown in the chart on this slide. In the first quarter of 2021, FDA approved more new drugs than any other first quarter in FDA history, with 14 new molecular entity approvals. However, from this graphic, you can also see that first quarter approval numbers are not necessarily predictive of annual approval numbers. For example, in 2018, a record-breaking year, total annually, only saw 6 Q1 approvals. But even so, to put this in kind of another light, 2021 approvals add up to about 2/3 of total approvals from 2016. So theoretically, FDA is set up for a banner year if it can maintain this pace. While numbers are not quite as strong for generics, the number of approvals in the last 3 months has been very consistent with historical averages, though the number of abbreviated new drug applications, or ANDAs, being submitted has continued to fall. As we've written about previously, that decrease is kind of alarming for the generic drug industry, since it indicates that there's likely to be fewer generic drugs approved in the future as the pharmaceutical industry invests more in biological products and drugs for rare diseases, which may not support quite as much generic competition. On the CDRH side, things have continued to be challenging. We've heard from a lot of companies that delays are common for some device types, and that there hasn't been as much capacity to provide advice to early stage submissions, also known as Q submissions. That's likely to continue until CDRH Diagnostics Division becomes less busy, hopefully later this year, though there may be a second surge resulting in delays as companies seek to convert their devices currently marketed through EUAs to full approvals. Finally, on the CBER side, approvals are way down compared to historical norms. From 2017 to 2019, there were about 22 novel approvals each year. In 2020, during the height of the pandemic, there were just 8 new biologics approved by CBER. And during this first quarter of 2021, there was just 1 new biologic approved, the Juno Therapeutics Breyanzi. That may be due to a few factors, including FDA's inability to conduct facility inspections in certain cases due to the pandemic, or the fact that several other high-profile biologics were reviewed through the EUA process, such as the case with COVID-19 vaccines. But it's definitely a data point to keep a close eye on. We've heard from more than a few companies that developing novel biologics during the pandemic has been really tough.
Thank you, Lily. Yeah, the difficulty of developing biologics, we've just heard so many companies talking about shortages of PPE, disruptions to clinical trial sites, especially for patients with immune system disorders. I think we're going to be seeing a slowdown for quite a while here. So shifting gears once again, talking about how the FDA is preparing for the next pandemic. And the question we keep hearing from our subscribers is, what does the FDA learn during the current pandemic, and what changes might it make to prepare for the next one? It's a question we've been asking and talking a lot about recently. If you're interested actually in a deeper dive in this topic, you should check out our YouTube channel, AgencyIQ. Find a copy of our last webinar where we kind of go into a bit more depth on this topic. But in the first quarter of this year, we've learned a lot about what the FDA and Biden administration want to do to improve the FDA and prepare it for that next pandemic, whenever that happens. Hopefully not soon, but preparation for this sort of thing takes quite a long time. I think the first thing to really explore is the FDA's Pandemic Recovery and Preparedness Plan, or PrEP initiative. That report was issued for the first time in January 2021, and was the initial result of an effort launched by then Commissioner Stephen Hahn in August 2020. The stated goal of the PrEP initiative is to make needed adjustments to support the ongoing COVID-19 response, while also strengthening the FDA's resilience and improving its capacity to respond to future public health emergencies. Now, that initial report that came out in January listed 12 potential opportunities and improvements, including planning and preparing for the review of medical products, strengthening the emergency use authorization process, and tools used to support the EUA process, deepening partnerships, sustaining innovation through clinical trial conduct, and also enhancing real-world monitoring of authorized medical products. So from that 12, the FDA was looking to kind of look at those as a source of ideas for the agency to consider as resources may permit, as it said. Those 12 were not meant to indicate that every single idea would be acted upon immediately, but it's more like a menu, so to speak. So a few weeks ago in early April, the FDA said it would initially take action on 5 of those 12 ideas, which it kind of combined into 4 broader categories. First, the FDA said it would identify areas of potential improvement for the EUA process after reviewing how it's worked for current products. So some big implications there for the device sector in particular. Second, it would review science-based communications to ensure they provide timely and accurate information. So that's something we certainly saw during the Trump administration that was sometimes problematic around, let's say, hydroxychloroquine, for example. Third, the FDA would evaluate how to use novel technologies such as virtual and video-enabled platforms to assist facility inspections. And we saw a guidance document released about this actually last week. And AgencyIQ subscribers, you can check out our website and read a lot more about that guidance. And fourth, the FDA would evaluate ways to improve the resilience of the supply chain through methods of tracking and monitoring product movement. So again, early on in the pandemic, there were lots of shortages. Some of those are ongoing, as many products that were made in regions that were under quarantine or lockdown, the flow of products just got tremendously disrupted. And you've probably heard a lot about Jenna Woodcock talking about continuous manufacturing as being one method to kind of combat that. So individual FDA divisions have also been calling for further reforms outside of the PrEP initiative. So for example, FDA Acting Commissioner Janet Woodcock, in addition to the continuous manufacturing stuff that she's talked about for years now, but more so during the pandemic, has also called for more expansive use of what are called master protocols, saying that only about 6% of clinical trials that were conducted during the pandemic were able to generate useful evidence. And master protocols are a way of having companies work together to kind of be able to compare their products to one another, and a common placebo group or active comparator group, which means that their trials can, in theory, be smaller, more responsive, but also generate higher qualities of evidence. Outside of CDER, the CDRH director, Jeffrey Shuren, has also called for a focus on supporting existing technologies with the potential to rapidly scale in the event of a public health emergency, perhaps driven by some of the diagnostic challenges that his division has seen, literally hundreds of EUAs that are the result of relatively small companies that in some cases have been pulled off the market because they haven't proven to be all that effective. In general, we expect 2021 to be a year in which the FDA is simultaneously responding to the current pandemic and also looking ahead to make reforms to prepare for the next pandemic. That's going to be a really difficult balancing act, we think, especially as legislators look to make their own changes to the FDA. But I do think the general strategy here is that the FDA realizes if it isn't proposing its own changes and improvements, legislators and advocacy groups are going to start proposing their own changes and controlling that narrative. It's kind of like that old adage, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So let's shift gears again and bring in our researcher, Kirsten Mesmer. Kirsten, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. Take us away.
Yeah, thanks, Alec. So there's generally a lot of curiosity on part of companies and investors when a new presidential administration comes in power. Essentially, what's going to happen next? Are things going to remain the same, or will there be small changes or major ones? One of the things I found most interesting has been investor interest in the FDA scrutiny of specific drugs, drug classes, and some drug types. Because to their credit, the FDA has been making some big moves against some of the drug products that it hasn't often done in the absence of major public scrutiny. I think one of the biggest things in the public's mind on the radar right now is FDA's industry-wide review of some cancer drugs that were originally approved under the accelerated approval. All those drugs currently are PD-1 and PD-L1 checkpoint inhibitors. They include Genentech's Tecentriq and AstraZeneca's Imfinzi. Both are approved for bladder cancer. Also, Merck's Keytruda and Bristol Myers Squibb's Opdivo for small lung cancer. These indications were withdrawn from the market by the companies in the past few months. However, there is a 3-day advisory committee meeting at the end of this month that looks closer at some more indications for Tecentriq, Keytruda, and Opdivo. This, of course, begs the questions, are these actions self-contained, or are these indicative of broader review that may extend to additional products? Keeping in mind that in the checkpoint inhibitor space, PD-1 and PD-L1 checkpoint inhibitors were the first ones to be approved back about 7 years ago. There are many others in that class, so there is a wide field that could come under scrutiny in the future. For now, I think that it is limited and probably class-specific, particularly in the current times where the FDA teams are already very stretched. But there's a potential for this to snowball into something bigger, so we'll have to keep a lookout what's going to happen in that over the next months and years. We know, for example, that the FDA's top cancer drug regulatory official, Rick Pazdur, has been advocating for changes to the accelerated approval program. Also, some legislators haven't been happy with the accountability of the accelerated approval program, believing that there is a lot of expensive drugs on the market that are still unproven because they haven't been shown the benefit in the confirmatory trials. This was also highlighted last week when the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission recommended a cut in reimbursement for drugs granted accelerated approval until they can confirm their benefits. This isn't entirely new. There have been a couple of articles over the past few years to put some checks into the accelerated approval and follow up on those. Looking at those pressures, it's entirely possible that Pazdur, Cavazzoni, and Woodcock are looking at the accelerated approval program and wonder, where can we demonstrate our commitment to our accountability and patient safety? Targeting some products without confirmed benefit may be one way to do that. Perhaps it's time to implement the checkpoint to confirm validity of accelerated approval. The scrutiny, by the way, isn't only on accelerated approval drugs. For example, in the last few weeks, the FDA has announced it will extend its regulatory reviews of 4 drugs covering 5 indications. All 4 drugs are Janus kinase inhibitors or JAK inhibitors. They are indicating regulatory concerns that maybe affect several additional products. 3 of those drugs are marketed by Pfizer, Eli Lilly in conjunction with Incyte and AbbVie. One of the products under extended review was developed by Pfizer but has never been approved in the past. As agency noted at the time, the notices indicated that the agency wanted additional information, and all these notices were quite similar to one another based on our review of the public company statements. This indicates that the FDA may have a concern about the safety profile of the entire product class. It's interesting to note that a similar drug made by Kadmon Holdings, which is a ROCK2 inhibitor that's similar to JAK inhibitors, was also subject to an extended review around the same time. Finally, the FDA is gearing up for one of the biggest review decisions in years this summer. Biogen's investigational Alzheimer's drug aducanumab is slated to receive a decision from the FDA after receiving a review extension in January. At this point, it's difficult to say what the agency will do. For one, for those who watched the advisory committee meeting for the drug back in November, that was a scathing committee hearing. The AdCom members were probably as harsh on the FDA analysis as they were on Biogen's data, arguing that the agency's credibility was at stake if they approved that product. Since the hearing, multiple members of the AdCom meeting have continued to speak out against the approval of aducanumab, including a big co-ed in JAMA Journal. Based on that, approval is probably a long shot, but if the FDA does support approval, it's going to be for a narrow population of patients and likely come with some significant post-marketing requirements and restrictions. The bottom line is that the first 3 months of the Biden administration, we've seen some unusual scrutiny for existing drugs and drugs under review, while the agency has also pushed one of its biggest decisions on the calendar. I don't know if this means we are seeing a more rigorous FDA and what this means long-term. After all, this is kind of a single point and we're only 3 months in. We'll need to watch it over time, but we're seeing some unusual churn in the regulatory waters, and it would mean some difficult sailing ahead. I give it back to you, Alec.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Kirsten. Moving on, as we talked about earlier, the FDA is coming up with some interesting timelines that are converging, and one of the biggest ones is it is about time for these user fee agreements that it has in place to get renewed. As many of you know, there are multiple major user fee agreements. Some of them are new and not yet up for renewal, like the OTC OMUFA program, but it's ones for prescription drugs, medical devices, generic drugs, and biosimilars are all coming up for renewal. And as a result, during the first 3 months of the Biden administration, a lot of the developments that the FDA has been involved with have been kind of happening behind closed doors and negotiating sessions between the FDA and industry. As we mentioned earlier, 2021 is a hugely important year for the life sciences industry and the FDA because of the renewal of these user fee agreements. And FDA and industry are now just trying to negotiate what do those agreements look like, what do they contain, and where does the agency and industry head next, and who pays for these things. So the negotiating teams for PDUFA, MDUFA, GDUFA, and BSUFA, as they are called, have all begun to meet already. I think the PDUFA teams represent by far the most advanced and complete negotiations so far. And there's been a substantial number of important proposals put forth, and some appear to be likely to be operationalized. And by that, I mean there is not a lot of disagreement between the FDA and industry at this point as negotiations kind of near their end. So for example, at the PDUFA negotiating session, the combined group has called for the creation of a program called the Split Real-Time Application Review, or STAR, which would be similar to the FDA's Real-Time Oncology Review pilot program. While many details around STAR are still shrouded in secrecy, the program would allow for the split submission and review of certain sections of eligible efficacy supplements, for all product types in all therapeutic areas. It would also likely involve elements of a rolling review and additional mid-cycle review meetings. For anyone who's not familiar with RTOR, that Real-Time Oncology Review program, it essentially allows companies to submit parts of their applications to the FDA even before a formal submission that allows the FDA to review it very, very quickly. And it's used predominantly for very high impact, important drugs for which early market access is really critical. Another major development related to PDUFA includes additional resources to support cell and gene therapy reviews by the FDA CBER, its Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, as well as deadlines for the review of manufacturing, prior approval supplements, IT modernization, and supports for digital health, such as a committee of digital health experts to promote consistency. I think the top line thing for PDUFA is we're going on to the 7th reauthorization. We're not talking necessarily about major overhauls at this point. We're talking about fine tuning, and you see that a lot with the PDUFA and to some extent the MDUFA negotiations as well. Not their first rodeo, so the changes tend to just be smaller in scope. The GDUFA, MDUFA, and BSUFA negotiations have also recently begun. AgencyIQ subscribers know that we wrote about the first 2 meetings of the MDUFA cycle just this week. The negotiations are still in very early stages right now relative to PDUFA, and I think a lot of that has to do with just the pandemic made these meetings very difficult to come by and really stretched FDA resources quite thin. But let's take a step back here to consider where all of these negotiation sessions are headed, because the user fee reauthorization process is a big deal for the FDA, patients, and for industry. It really is one of those make or break pieces of legislation that if it's not passed will just wreak havoc on the life sciences industry. And that means it's a point of leverage for legislators. The life sciences industry and FDA are going to need to pay really close attention to a few things because of this. First, what the appetite of legislators is for reforms. It's pretty typical that user fee reauthorization bills wind up being vehicles for larger reforms like FDASIA, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act in 2012, and FDARA, or the FDA Reauthorization Act in 2012. But FDARA was in some ways muted relative to what it could have been since the 21st Century Cures Act passed in 2016 and contained a ton of FDA reforms. Following the pandemic, though, there's likely to be a lot of reforms in the next user fee legislation. Maybe it's known as the FDA Pandemic Response Act or FDAPRA or something. If they want to use that acronym, you heard it here first. But I think the upshot of all this is not likely to be a lesser reauthorization bill. This is likely to be a Christmas tree on which many different groups hang a lot of different ornaments. And speaking of which, companies do need to be wary about the potential for the legislation to become a vehicle for other reforms, such as those related to drug pricing. I've said this for years, but if legislators really wanted to, they could attach drug pricing legislation to the PDUFA reauthorization legislation and market it as sort of a comprehensive approval, pricing, and development bill affecting the life sciences industry. We know legislators want to make big reforms to drug pricing and that they want to tackle it. We know that Democrats are aware that they have a very narrow window in which they're likely to hold the White House, House, and Senate. And we know that user fee reauthorizations are due to occur just before elections when politicians want to score as many political points with the voting public as possible. This could make for a perfect storm for the FDA and the user fee reauthorization legislation, and things are already in motion. We're expecting to start to see legislative proposals emerging in the next few months. You may have actually seen today, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, both Democrats and Republicans, released respective bills on drug pricing, and there are some FDA implications within those bills if you get a chance to look at that. And those new legislative proposals in general, not just drug pricing, are going to be made with the goal of being combined into larger legislative reform packages. And again, kind of beating the drum here, dead horse, but industry and FDA really need to pay attention, close attention to this convergence, because things are going to start off slow and then things are going to move very, very fast. All right, so I know we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to also remind folks, if you do have questions, please let us know. We'll be happy to answer those either at the end or follow up with folks over email. I'm going to go a little bit fast through this next slide because I do have 2 more slides that I want Laura to have time to talk about. But for number 9 here, the FDA truly has been mostly left alone. I mean, compared to the FDA under the Trump administration, when then Commissioner Stephen Hahn and then President Donald Trump were practically in open battle with each other, what has been notable has been how little the Biden administration appears to be shaping or directing the FDA. And as political reporting has indicated, the White House has mostly been playing catch up with the FDA's decisions, including its decision to recommend a halt to the use of J&J's vaccine. And that sort of action under the Trump administration probably would have been maybe not unthinkable, but pretty close to it. And in fact, there's really quite a stark contrast between how the FDA was treated during the prior administration and the Biden administration now. The FDA now does its own press releases and statements. They aren't funneled through the White House or the president as they were under Trump. And each decision isn't trumpeted as a personal victory for the president, again, as it often was during the prior administration. In fact, I can't even recall Biden and Woodcock being at a public appearance together. I may be wrong there, but I follow this stuff more closely than most, and I just can't remember a single appearance together. Now, some of that may be related to the FDA's decrease in popularity as of late. It may be because Woodcock is only serving in acting capacity. It may be because Biden tends to want to give agencies more leeway to respond to the pandemic without being seen as micromanaging the politics or of the response as his predecessor was. But whatever the reason, it's giving the FDA a lot of leeway to do things the way it wants. Now, there are risks associated with that, and without political support, the agency may find itself making plenty of decisions that clash with powerful opinions or lead to a lot of subcommittee hearings. But coming from a very recent time when CBER needed to basically smuggle an FDA guidance document on vaccine standards for EUAs, and when FDA's regulatory authority was routinely being eroded in big ways by the administration and HHS, I think FDA officials are happy just to have some leeway again. So moving ahead again, Laura D'Angelo, I want to bring you in here and talk about EUAs even more. Laura?
Sure thing, Alec. So the FDA has a long-term problem in that during the pandemic, it has allowed hundreds of products to be marketed under two general approaches, both EUAs and enforcement discretion policies that have allowed products to be marketed as long as they conform to best practices, but without the majority of the typical pre-market review process. The big so what of this problem, and especially going forward, is how to get those products off of the market. So I'm of course referring to products whose time has come. So either they were never great to begin with, the virus itself is mutated and they're no longer necessary, or the pandemic and clinical practice has just changed and evolved such that the products are no longer needed. That is a really tricky problem, as it turns out. If your policy is enacted too quickly, you risk depriving patients and especially providers who are in danger of the virus of needed treatments. And if it's too slow, you risk harming patients who might have been better served by better, more proven technologies. So what we've started to see in recent weeks is the outline of what we think the FDA is going to do for a lot of specifically device types, which were, again, the significant majority of the products for which these flexibilities have been leveraged. So first, the FDA is going to determine what the market need is for these products. So if there's not much need anymore, it will decide to take action. If there is still a need there, it won't just yet. So from what we've seen so far, the FDA isn't yet taking things away from providers. It's more assessing if there's even a demand for these products on the market. Second, we've seen it will freeze new access to a pathway, such as devices marketed through an enforcement discretion policy. So that allows the devices that are already on the market under such a pathway to stay there, but it won't let new things on through the flexibility. Third, and this is where we start to guess and project a little bit, we think FDA will eventually announce a sunset date for marketed devices to either cease their marketing or initiate submission marketing through a more traditional pathway, or a pathway that is still available to them. So if an EUA is still available, or a full PMA or de novo or 510K. This is in CDRH's priority list for 2021. But timing of formal guidance remains up in the air, and of course, there's likely to be a big CDRH-wide guidance, and then additional information will need to come for specific product types, and especially diagnostics, from their respective centers. And then fourth, it's eventually going to want to encourage any remaining EUAs to transition to full approvals, and that's going to take up a lot of time and resources for the agency to do so. So far, the FDA hasn't really done this with many products just yet. Full face filtering respirators, or FFRs, are the first product to go kind of through the breach, but we're expecting it to be the first of many. And of course, the trajectory of process by which the respiratory equipment flexibilities were rolled back might not actually be the best model for mapping out what we expect for other medical devices, because FFRs are actually under shared authority between FDA and CDC, and they are pretty much just as much a workplace safety issue for healthcare providers as they are a medical device subject to FDA regulation. But even companies without products that are marketed via EUAs or under the enforcement discretion really should be taking notice of this kind of trajectory, because it's likely to have an effect on them all the same. FDA's review divisions are going to be inundated with products that are simultaneously seeking approval or clearance at some point, and that is likely to have a continued negative effect on review timelines. And for some product types, it could also mean new competition as products that have made changes, especially digital integration, during the pandemic, and therefore collected data during the pandemic, that are now seeking full market access. Of course, for some products, the FDA has no qualms about taking more decisive action. If you were watching Lilly's announcements last week, you know that FDA has no problem withdrawing a product's EUA after reviews found that it wasn't effective against the emergent and now dominant strains of the coronavirus. Product does still have an EUA for use as part of a combination therapy. It does go to show that FDA isn't just looking at the EUAs as a one-way street. Though I do think we're likely to see FDA's EUAs for some of more of these products remain in effect for several years, as we see for previous outbreaks such as Ebola. And then number 11, FDA is feeling the strain. We've touched on this pretty pointedly throughout the presentation, but just very quickly, because I know that we are at time, and if you do have questions, please send them in. A big point of order for the FDA and industry is the operational strain that is at the agency. So regulators working at surge capacity for over a year, and we're continuing to see what it looks like when the pandemic is both a priority, but regular work needs to be prioritized as well. From a staffing perspective, FDA, like any government agency, has never had incredibly good luck. The Office of In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health has had to pull staff from other microbiology divisions within CDRH. They've also tried to hire new staff, but this has caused some trickle-down capacity challenges. So we are, again, starting to see departures, high-level departures, as we expected, both with the change in administration and the ongoing surge capacity. And that is, we are already seeing that become a concern, especially in CDRH, which already had a lot of vacant seats in the MDUFA negotiations. It's still too early to see how we're going to be impacting the fiscal year 2021 performance goals, but it's likely to not be on target. And the last thing I'll touch on here, and definitely send in questions, is that some commitments are being met, but we're starting to see pushback on how, especially in the MDUFA negotiations for things like digital health innovation and deficiency and additional information letters, and how the FDA is going about meeting its commitments without technically meeting the spirit. So turning it back over to Alec.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Laura, and apologies that we are a little bit light on time to answer questions. If you do send those in, we will make sure to get those to you, or if you'd like to ask us questions privately, my email address is right here. We did get one that I want to address quickly. FDA has been cited as becoming more severe in their reviews, and predictions are that things are going to get a lot tougher for sponsors. You've pointed out some issues, but any insight into gene therapy and the spate of recent clinical holds? That's a great question. I think there are a few things that I would point to in the briefest of terms here, and we can follow up after. One is FDA's decision to have a extended review or a clinical hold, I can't quite remember, on a gene therapy product for lack of confirmation of long-term clinical benefit. I do think that the FDA is weighing the safety effects of treatment itself on the need for a patient to undergo that treatment again and again, and if it's a particularly important, let's say, thing that is being fixed, if a patient comes to rely on that and then it fails, it does seem to be scrutinizing that a little bit more. The other thing too is just that we've seen the pandemic's effect on the quality of data, that many trials have been disrupted, and we're still yet to see if the FDA is going to ask sponsors to go back and collect additional data. FDA seems to be paying very close attention to critical quality attributes of cellular therapies in particular, and by extension some gene therapies, and asking for companies to really prove that the quality of their product is indicative of the efficacy of that product. And finally, just review strains on CBER. It has been very difficult for the FDA to find time to review some of these products, or during the pandemic even get out and inspect some of the facilities to support that. So great question. With that being said, we're going to call it here, but Colleen, Any final words?
Nope, that's it. Thanks so much to our research team for presenting today, and thank you all who attended. As you can see, my email is right there, so if you would like the slides or the recording from today or more information regarding AgencyIQ, go ahead and send me an email at cconnolly@agencyIQ.com. And with that, we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.